It is March 4th, 2025, and Zelensky is now speaking out and saying that his meeting with Trump at the White House on Friday was regrettable. He's not saying, I'm sorry for my actions. He's saying, I'm sorry that you were hurt, right? I'm sorry that you feel that way. I don't know that that's going to be enough to really bring Trump around, as his latest statements have been that, hey, Zelensky needs to get on board with plans for a ceasefire in the war in Ukraine, or else he may not be around much longer. But how likely is a ceasefire to actually come about? Is that what Russia actually wants right now when they are actively winning this war? And one of their major concerns is dealing with a frozen conflict that then leads to another war like this one years down the road. And what does all of this mean for where things are headed, especially as you have the UK really stepping up here, right? Really taking the lead and being that one in charge. At least Keir Starmer seems to think that he's the one in charge as he embraces Zelensky in London. And then he gives this big speech talking about all of these plans that Europe has, just as long as they have Washington's support. Well, we got into all of the latest and took a look at where things could be headed with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as it's being reported that instead of putting pressure on Russia to try to force them into negotiations, which we obviously know would not work, the Trump administration is now putting pressure on Zelensky to get him to quote unquote pursue peace by putting a pause on US military aid to Ukraine. And I saw an update earlier that Zelensky is now coming out kind of, I don't know that he's necessarily apologizing, but he's saying like, hey, we need to work through this. Like, it was regrettable what happened on Friday and his back and forth with Trump. How do you see the significance of what is playing out right now? Are we seeing the Trump administration actually move to pull military aid, or is this just about another bargaining tactic to try to kind of force Zelensky's hand?
Okay, I don't know. And that's what I'm wondering too. And I want to be perfectly honest. My ability to predict what Trump will do or won't do is in such question because I mean, I don't know anyone who's necessarily been 100% on Trump or even much better, but I don't know at this point. A lot of it, of course, depends on how Zelensky reacts. Another part of it is how Russia will respond to this. Because I'm almost certain that Russia will try to exploit the situation for all it's worth, while seeking to diplomatically improve relations with the U.S. on a separate bilateral relationship. And I think it's important there to draw a distinction because this is what Russia is trying to do. There are two diplomatic processes that have a degree of overlap, right? But Russia would like to keep that overlap to a minimum. One is a restoration of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Russia, which, of course, because the Biden administration cut them off, it is, behoove that Trump should be the first one, to make these steps, right? Because they cut off diplomatic relations. Russia only responded in a quid pro quo fashion. So they're, creating agreements to possibly restore diplomatic property, increase the embassy staffing levels from the skeleton crew they had been reduced to back up. They're talking about restoring air flights, which would allow direct flights, which would allow diplomats to shuttle back and forth to their countries and make their work much easier. Basically, Russia's saying, if you want to negotiate things with us, Ukraine, Iran, other things, we're going to have to actually have diplomatic relations again. And until we go through that, then nothing else can be done. So Russia is clearly dragging this out and also trying to draw a degree of remove, because I still think Russia is not very optimistic about any potential settlement, any type of peace agreement with the Kiev regime in Ukraine being negotiated either with or the United States, or with the U.S. as some kind of intermediary, or trying to suddenly play the role of a interested third party, which of course they're not. They've been a party to this conflict, and now at least you can argue they are becoming less a party. And there does seem to be word on the ground that not only Trump, first of all, Trump has not asked for any new money, and it has not sent any new aid package. However, Biden was shoving out so much stuff during the last months of his presidency, at least theoretically a half a year's worth of military supplies. That was still coming. And what we know from mainstream media reports, we haven't had an official statement to this effect from the White House, but we know from officials talking to the media, right, usually on the basis of anonymity or a Pentagon official or so on, that they say that all shipments of arms to stop, not just new shipments, but things that were being shipped, like in process. For instance, the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk reported today that he can confirm that U.S. military supplies that were already in Poland, waiting to be shipped across the border to Ukraine, have now been stopped as well. So the train of supplies has stopped. Now, how long will it last? Who knows, right? That ultimately depends, on whether Trump at this point wants to see Ukraine just go away and want some degree of, I don't know, payback, vengeance for any slights perceived, or whether Zelensky, rolls over, shows his belly, and plays submissive enough that the silverback Donald Trump is satisfied with his show of submission and then restarts them. But once he's stopped it, here's the problem. If he restarts it, that's going to be then a major impediment to improving relations with Russia, right? Because if he hadn't stopped it, okay, that's a negotiating point. But if he stops it unilaterally and then restarts it, suddenly he's now, fully responsible for this. And it has to be said that there still are, because a lot of what, Biden over the last couple of years has supplied the Kiev regime with is not just Pentagon stocks off the shelves, but contracts with the U.S. military industrial complex for production. As it's produced, it is sent to Ukraine, right? And that would resume, theoretically, if he lifted this pause. We also know that there have been no missile strikes in Russia, even in the Russian-controlled parts, or the former Ukraine, Donbass, Kherson, Zaporozhye. There's been no ATACMS strikes. There's been, I haven't even seen HIMARS actually being used, right? Because they also require U.S. Satellite data, which is another interesting point. I'm waiting to see, and I want to see how serious Trump is about this, because while the arms is a big one, the other two big things would be, is Starlink cut off, right? Because Starlink provided by Elon Musk, but then he kind of shuffled his responsibility away from himself to the Pentagon. So the Pentagon now has responsibility for Ukraine's Starlink use. And supposedly Poland is paying for it. So that's rather unusual. So that's another thing. And that would be a major problem for the Kiev regime. If they weren't able to use Starlink for communications, Russia could jam and tap the communications at will. They can still often do it, at least locally, with Starlink now. They have that capability. But without it, the Kiev regime would have no secure communications, and it would severely impact their drone use as well, because the drones are flown through Starlink to a very high degree. So they wouldn't be able to, and that's their major, with the artillery deficiencies and missile deficiencies and everything. Now their over reliance on drones would very seriously affect their status on the battlefield. And the other one is intelligence. And people often underestimate how important US provided intelligence, particularly satellite data, is. If they lose that, then they're fighting blind, right? And their surveillance, their ability that is no further than their reconnaissance drones, right? It would have a major effects on the battlefield. So we'll see in the coming days. We do know also that Trump's administration has ordered the Pentagon to stop offensive cyber warfare activity against Russia, right? That's another de-escalation step. Now, I don't know, does this also apply to the NSA and the CIA and possibly other intelligence agencies that have their own, cyber warfare units? I don't know, but we know that the order at least has gone out to the Pentagon. And we also have the word through the State Department that financing for the long-term and ongoing process of trying to sustain and rebuild the Kiev regime's energy infrastructure, particularly their electrical infrastructure, that financing has also been stopped by the Trump administration. So these are already fairly significant things. But what does Trump really intend? We don't know. Obviously, he's gone farther than most people thought, including myself, thought that he would. So how much further he will go to twisting Zelensky. And by the way, Zelensky has put out a statement saying that the events in the White House were regrettable and it's time to make things right. But he never actually apologized. He said it did not go the way it was supposed to be. It is regrettable that it happened this way. It is time to make things right. Yeah, that is not going to satisfy Donald Trump as an apology. That is not a sufficient show of contrition and submission that Trump has demanded from him, and made that case to the American people. So that's not enough. The fact that the Europeans have rallied so defiantly around Zelensky in the face of Trump's kicking him out of the White House, and these steps. And now the EU is practically declaring war. The EU and the UK and possibly Canada as well have practically declared, war themselves, not only against, they say outright, we're not only fighting Russia now, we're fighting the Trump administration, which already puts us in a bizarro world.
Yeah, it was interesting to see, especially with Zelensky's statement, because it's almost an "I'm sorry I made you feel that way," or right, "I'm sorry you felt that way" kind of
I'm
thing.
sorry
Not
you
an
felt that way, yeah.
I'm actually sorry that, for what I said. No, and I'm with you. I think that Trump is wanting him to literally beg for the US for its support. And it's interesting too, because what you were mentioning there, when it comes to Russia, look, they are watching everything, right? It's not just like they're focusing on what Trump is saying and what they're hearing from his administration directly. They're also paying attention to what that administration is saying to all of Europe. And just last month, we had Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth sit there at the Ukraine Contact Defense Group, and he's telling his European allies, we need you to handle Russia so that we can focus on China. So Russia's hearing that, and they've got to be going, okay, you're saying you want to pursue normalization with us, but then you're kind of like acting like you're sending Europe like the attack dog to come and fight with us to handle things, but yet you want peace. It's like you can't have two things at once here. But it is interesting too when it comes to the way that Kiev is kind of reacting to these reports that Trump is cutting off military aid, at least temporarily. Well, you've got Ukraine's prime minister saying that Kiev still has the capabilities and the tools to maintain the situation on the front line. That's as Zelensky is claiming that Kiev has Germany, saying in a post on X that Berlin is the he said in a
Just do me a favor, people, and type up German military report or anything along those lines. The German military is in even sorrier state than the British or the French military. So,
and that's saying a
yes,
lot.
that's saying a lot. I mean, the British military that has more horses than it has tanks, right? And more admirals than it has, well, certainly artillery pieces at this point, but ships as well. So it's,
Yeah, and having Europe in this position where they're like rallying around Kiev. I mean, we saw that summit in London over the weekend. We saw the ridiculous group photo that looked so sad. No one looked happy to be there. No one looked like they were like, yeah, we're going to take on Russia, even though Keir Starmer, and even to that end, in his little speech that he gave, he's laying out this 4-point plan of how we're going to, hit Russia in this way and target them in that way. And then at the end, he's like, oh, yeah, but we also need the United States in order for this all to work out. How do you view this?
yeah, Keir
Sorry.
Starmer promises 100 years of security guarantees to Ukraine, but we need security guarantees for the U.S. for us to provide security guarantees for you. Oh, it's so
Yeah,
pathetic.
that's what we're dealing with at this point. So how do you view, I mean, and granted, on top of that, Europe can't even agree, right? You have the UK and all of these other EU members that are in this position where it's like they're constantly bickering on, do we send troops here? Do we send aid there? So what does that mean for Kiev and for the actual literal tangible support, like you were saying, that it needs on the battlefield?
Yeah, I mean the only thing Europe can really supply is effectively is moral support, right? They can provide financing, but even that is limited. The European economies are in bad shape, right? Every one of their governments are deep in debt, with and practically everyone, I think except for Germany, over 100% of their GDP in the whole, right? And Germany's coming up on that pretty hard. They can, of course, borrow more money. Von der Leyen today is talking about $150 billion fund intended for domestic military industrial production improvement. Right, a rearming Europe, which of course means rearming Ukraine, since everything they have goes right in one door and out the other. But we've also heard statements from the outgoing German chancellor, and on this, I'm sure he's, there will be no change once Merz, the leader of the Christian Democratic Union, forms a government and takes over. But also from Keir Starmer, right? That even after a presumed ceasefire, which Russia says no ceasefire, even after a supposed peace agreement, which, again, the only one who wants peace at this point is Donald Trump. Russia doesn't want peace because they're not done yet, right? And arguably they may not want, certainly not before all of Donbass and Kherson and Zaporozhye are retrieved, either militarily or diplomatically, and militarily seems a lot more likely, and the Kiev regime is completely kicked out of Kursk. But growing statements seem to indicate that they don't see this ever ending until the regime is removed root and branch from Kiev, at least, and possibly all the way to Lvov, right? And they sense opportunity here. Zelensky doesn't want peace because he doesn't accept that the Kiev regime has been beaten, right? I mean, and the ultra nationalists, the Banderite fascists that fight for him and that are peppered throughout the government, the security services, the Rada. I mean, they would prefer to die fighting, right? They will not surrender, even if other people do, right? And don't want to be forcibly conscripted. They would fight to the end. And there's still no indication that there's anyone able to push Zelensky out of office unless it's Zelenskyy, and they would have to get the go ahead from the United Kingdom as well, and they're standing firmly behind Zelensky at the moment because Zelensky is technically in exile as the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK. So that all gets really interesting. Then you've got this specter rising up of this minerals deal, where Trump is still talking about a minerals deal is still on the table, and you've got Zelensky and the Kiev regime's prime minister Schmiegel both talking about the mineral deal. Now, this is unconfirmed, right? But there are reports in the Ukrainian media, particularly a number of Ukrainian Telegram channels, right, that cover the conflict and are maybe the freest quote unquote media um, in Ukraine, right? Where because of the total information policy, the regime has complete control of all TV channels, radio, newspapers, everything like this. But here, Ukrainian channel Resident Ukraine writes, and they're not the only ones saying this, others have said this at this point, and it's unconfirmed. But our source in the presidential office in Kiev said that the issue with relations with the U.S. is not about Zelensky's apology. We simply can't sign the agreement on rare earth minerals, in which the Americans included the gas transit system and ports, as well as a number of strategic enterprises, because Ukraine has already handed them over to the UK in a secret agreement as an annex to their 100-year security guarantees, and now will be forced to fight without U.S. assistance. Now, they say also what I would if that was true, what I would immediately think, all these details were well known to U.S. intelligence, which is why Trump requested this document. So if that's true, and they continue, again, unconfirmed, I have no independent confirmation of this. This is Ukrainian channel saying this. But if that's true, and this deal is resurrected, and they go to the table to sign it, and then Trump, has it revealed that, oh, they've been dangling the Americans all along while they've already promised this to the United Kingdom. That would be the I can completely walk away and not look back moment, right? So let's see if there's any credence to these rumors that is really what is going on here, and that then would be a trap, an ambush laid, or at least that the Trump administration is giving Zelensky and the Kiev regime enough rope to hang themselves.
Interesting. I had not even considered that. And yeah, it's also interesting too, because I know that's one of the things that we've been talking about, the fact that, look, when it comes to the rare earth minerals in Ukraine, Trump and his administration, they're acting like we have to get this is a big deal. But you're not talking about an immediate payoff. You're not even talking about necessarily a wealth when it comes to that payoff. And
Yeah.
you're also bringing in the fact that Russia controls the majority of the natural resources in pre 2014 Ukraine. So the US would be putting itself in this weird position where it was trying to now fight Russia for control. And it's like, okay, if they're just doing this to kind of say, hey, we know what you did, that being Zelensky, we know what you gave to the UK, that could also explain why the UK has been
Good.
at the forefront of this, right? Whereas now it's like Keir Starmer is stepping up. He's, giving all these press conferences, acting like he's taking charge. Zelensky's running into his arms after getting scolded by Trump like a child at the White House.
Mommy, Daddy said mean things to me.
Literally. It
Did
was
you
so sad.
see? Even Der Spiegel wrote an article. Now you remember Simon Schuster talking to Ukrainian officials. Was it already? Is it already 2 years ago now? Where Ukrainian officials told Time magazine, Simon Schuster, that Zelensky was delusional, that you couldn't tell him anything, and describing him as an emperor with no clothes. Now you have Der Spiegel, the German magazine, right? That has been a rah-rah around Zelensky and the Kiev regime, up and, entirely up to this point. They are now quoting, in the aftermath of the fracas in the White House, also anonymous officials within the Kiev regime, multiple ones, saying outright Zelensky has a mind like a petulant child, that he is unable to face reality, he is unable to change course, that he is a danger, and that he reacts emotionally to everything. It's damning, right? It's damning. And this is coming out where obviously the German government, that is still full-throatedly supporting him, is completely ignoring this, right? So it is interesting that that's also coming out in Der Spiegel. So if you, like me, felt that Zelensky was acting like a entitled, spoiled brat, a petulant child in the White House throwing a temper tantrum, don't worry, you're not alone in this. Zelensky's own officials think the same thing.
We saw the ambassador right there in the Oval Office putting her head in her hands, literally just being so frustrated, because it's like, yeah, he refused to just stop talking. He refused to accept, and then finally Trump kind of has to jump in, because once you get to that point, it's like you're surrounded by all of these cameras and reporters. He's got to say something to kind of bring Zelensky down a peg, and I think that he certainly did that. Now, the last thing that I want to ask you about revolves around kind of some of the comments that we've been hearing lately. So Zelensky talked to Sky News and he said, oh, it's going to be really tough to, remove me. You can have another election, but you're going to have to stop me from running, blah, blah, blah. Well, then Trump comes out on Monday and he suggests, because he didn't say Zelensky by name, but that he won't be around very long if he doesn't agree to a ceasefire deal with Russia. Now, obviously, as you noted earlier, it's not like Russia's going to agree to a ceasefire deal overnight. That's not what they want right now. But bringing into this the fact that we're getting to this point where it is impossible for the US to deal with Zelensky, they see that, well, if you want to hold an election, you can do so, but there's no way it can be a free and fair election because you've already banned all of the opposition and the
More than
remaining guys.
20. All the real
Yeah,
opposition parties
right.
have been
All of
banned in the
exactly
country.
all of the top opposition.
All the
And
critical media has been banned in the country. The largest church in the country is undergoing a literal pogrom. The leaders of all the opposition parties have been charged with treason for not being politically loyal. So you can say elections all you want. The problem is that you can't have a real election in Ukraine unless you get rid of this regime. That's the problem. He's left no alternative for removing him from power except by coup or by force, right? That's all that is left. And Russia, a lot of people are like, "Oh, why doesn't Russia just take out Zelensky?" Because he's so incompetent that literally anyone they put in his place would be more capable than him. And if it's someone like Zelensky, whom is a committed Banderite fascist himself, right, with two busts of Bandera and one of Shukovich in his office, and the big red and black Banderite flag when he was the commander of the Kiev regime's military, he would not be any more likely to sign a peace deal. Poroshenko became an ultra nationalist. I can't imagine he would be any more disposed about it. The problem is that when you head a Banderite regime, you have to play to the Banderites because they are the basis of your power. And so even if by coup or some type of internal U.S. throwing their support to someone else, who, right? Poroshenko, Zelensky, who else, right? I mean, who else could they that would result in a real change? No, it couldn't, right? Because the half of Ukraine that doesn't agree with everything since the Maidan has been completely had their political voices and rights erased since the Maidan. I'm not hopeful that, first of all, that they'll necessarily be able to get rid of Zelensky, and second of all, even if they do, that it will unless you get rid of the regime, it will simply result in another Maidan regime figure that could potentially even be worse than Zelensky.
Yeah, you've got Trump in this situation where he's looking at it going, okay, how do we get rid of this guy, right? How do we pull off a coup in Kiev? And the people around him are like, sir, we already did that. And this is the result that now you are having to live, not just the rest of the world, but you are having to live with the results of.
But when has the U.S. ever learned its lesson, right?
That's true. If there's one thing we can count on, it is them just doing the same thing over and over again.
That's what the Europeans want to do. More sanctions, more weapons. That's all they're saying. That's what
maybe if there's a 17th sanctions package, then that will be what makes Russia fall, and then that will, they just had to get to that number. They're figuring it out.
As Trump pointed out today, Europe is still spending more money buying Russian energy than they are providing military aid to the Kiev regime. Yeah, because they need to. They don't have any choice.
Yeah, they did not think this one through when I don't know that they thought that they were vassal states of the US, but they certainly were not the smartest ones. A lot at stake here all around, and I always appreciate you taking the time to join me to break down the latest here. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanction. You can also find Sanction over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.